It started like any ordinary day. Jake, a 10-year-old boy from Ohio, was riding his bike through the quiet streets of his neighborhood, a place where the troubles of the world seemed far away. Little did anyone know that what would happen next would change his life, and possibly the lives of millions, forever. After a terrible accident that left him teetering between life and death, Jake experienced something extraordinary. He claims to have met Jesus and was shown visions of a future America, including events in 2025 that he says will both inspire and terrify you. Here is Jake's remarkable story. Jake was like any other 10-year-old, full of energy, mischief, and a love for adventure. That fateful day began innocently enough. He had spent the morning watching cartoons and pestering his older sister before deciding to take his bike out for a ride. It was autumn in Ohio, and the leaves painted the streets in vibrant shades of red, orange, and yellow. Jake loved the crunch of leaves under his wheels and the crisp air that seemed to whisper promises of fun. The bike ride started uneventfully. He rode past familiar houses, waved at Mrs. Connors who was tending her garden, and sped down the slight hill at the end of the cul-de-sac. He felt unstoppable, like the world was his playground. But all it took was one split second for everything to change. As Jake raced around a corner, he didn't notice the delivery van backing out of a driveway. His brakes screeched, tires skidding on loose gravel. He tried to swerve, but it was too late. The collision was unavoidable. Witnesses would later say that Jake flew through the air like a ragdoll, landing with a sickening thud on the asphalt. His small body lay still as neighbors rushed to his side, calling 911 in panic. When the paramedics arrived, Jake's pulse was faint. His parents, who had been inside the house just a block away, arrived moments later. His mother collapsed in tears while his father stood frozen. The color drained from his face. Jake was unresponsive, his breathing shallow. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, clinging to life by a thread. Jake doesn't remember the ambulance ride or the frantic voices of doctors shouting orders in the ER. What he does remember is waking up in a place that felt otherworldly. At first, he thought he was dreaming. He found himself standing in an open field, surrounded by light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The colors were more vivid than anything he'd ever seen. Greens that seemed to glow, blues that shimmered like they were alive. I wasn't scared, Jake would later recount. I felt peaceful, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. As he wandered through this ethereal landscape, he noticed figures in the distance. They weren't people, at least not in the way we think of them. They seemed to radiate light and warmth. Jake couldn't make out their faces, but he felt their presence, like they were welcoming him, guiding him. He began to walk toward them, his small feet barely brushing the ground. Then he saw it, a radiant figure unlike any of the others. Jake didn't need to be told who it was. He just knew it was Jesus. Jesus appeared to Jake not as the solemn, stern figure often depicted in religious paintings, but as someone who felt approachable and kind. He radiated love, and Jake said it was like standing in sunlight after being cold for a very long time. Jake felt every fear, every worry, every ounce of pain melt away. "You're safe here," Jesus told him, his voice gentle but filled with authority. Jake wasn't sure how to respond, but he didn't need to. Jesus seemed to understand everything he was feeling. He reached out his hand, and Jake took it. Instantly, Jake was flooded with memories, not just of his life, but of moments he hadn't lived yet. It was like seeing the world from a higher perspective, understanding things he couldn't have possibly known. "I want to show you something," Jesus said. And with those words, Jake was no longer in the field of light. He was standing in what looked like a busy city street, but it wasn't any city he recognized. It was America in 2025. Jake's first impression of 2025 was a strange mix of awe and unease. The city around him looked futuristic, with sleek buildings that seemed to touch the sky. People moved with a sense of purpose, but there was also a heaviness in the air, like they were carrying invisible burdens. Jesus walked beside Jake, pointing out details as if he were a tour guide. "There's hope here," Jesus said, "but there's also fear." They're at a crossroads. Jake saw images flash before his eyes. People protesting, holding signs that read "Unity for all" and "End the divide." He saw leaders speaking to massive crowds, their words stirring both hope and anger. But then he saw something that gave him chills: natural disasters, floods sweeping through towns, fires consuming forests. Jake didn't understand it all, but Jesus reassured him. "These challenges will test them," Jesus explained, "but they will also bring them together." One of the most vivid parts of Jake's vision was the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election. Jesus showed him a divided nation struggling to heal. The new president, whose name Jake didn't hear, but whose face seemed familiar, was working tirelessly to bring people together. "He's not perfect," Jesus said, "but he listens, and that will make all the difference." Jake saw scenes of people debating passionately but respectfully, of communities coming together to rebuild what had been broken, both physically and emotionally. There were still disagreements, still challenges, but there was also progress. Jake felt a sense of hope he couldn't quite explain. "This is the path forward," Jesus told him. "It won't be easy, but it will be worth it." As Jake watched these visions unfold, he felt a deep sense of responsibility. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to share what he had seen. And just like that, he was back in his hospital bed, gasping for air, his parents crying with relief by his side. When Jake returned to life, one of the clearest memories from his vision was seeing how Americans began to heal their divisions. Jesus had shown him that the years leading up to 2025 were filled with anger and misunderstanding, but he also revealed a turning point, a moment when people realized they couldn't keep fighting forever. Jake saw images of neighborhoods where people started talking again, not through screens, but face to face. Communities organized block parties, food drives, and local events where people of all ages and backgrounds came together. Jake remembered Jesus pointing out a man in one of these scenes, a veteran who decided to turn his yard into a community garden. What started as a small act of kindness became a movement. People followed his lead, creating spaces where everyone could work together, grow food, and share their stories. "It's not the big changes that bring unity," Jesus had said. "It's the small acts of love, repeated over and over." The vision wasn't all rosy. Jake saw moments of tension too. There were heated arguments at town hall meetings and disagreements about what the country's priorities should be. But what stood out most was how people began to listen. They didn't always agree, but they stopped shouting long enough to hear each other. One of the most powerful scenes Jake described was a group of students from different backgrounds coming together to paint a mural in their city. The mural depicted hands of all colors joined together under a banner that read, "Stronger Together." Jake remembered how real it felt, the hope, the determination. It was a reminder that change starts at the ground level, with everyday people deciding to be better. Another striking part of Jake's vision was seeing how America's economy began to recover. Jesus showed him bustling factories and innovative businesses that looked different from what Jake was used to. These places weren't just about profit, they were about purpose. People were working on projects that not only benefited themselves, but also their communities and the environment. Jake remembered a scene where workers were assembling solar panels and wind turbines in a massive warehouse. Jesus explained that a renewed focus on renewable energy was driving much of the economic growth. Industries that had once seemed outdated were finding new life, adapting to the needs of a changing world. Jake saw former coal miners working in clean energy plants, their skills repurposed for a greener future. Small businesses were thriving too. Jesus showed Jake a bakery run by a single mom who had lost her job during the pandemic. Through grants and community support, she was able to reopen her business, and it became a cornerstone of her neighborhood. Jake could see how her success inspired others, sparking a ripple effect of hope and opportunity. One of the most surprising things Jake saw was how people started valuing work differently. It wasn't just about making money anymore. There was a renewed sense of pride in creating something meaningful. People were encouraged to innovate, to think outside the box. Schools and colleges shifted their focus, teaching students not just to get a job, but to solve problems and improve the world around them. Jesus emphasized the importance of fairness in this new economy. Jake saw leaders implementing policies that helped close the gap between the wealthy and the struggling. There were still challenges, but there was a clear effort to ensure everyone had a chance to thrive. In one of the most vivid parts of Jake's vision, Jesus showed him the transformation of the environment. It started with scenes of devastation. Forests reduced to ash, rivers choked with garbage, and wildlife struggling to survive. But then Jake saw something incredible. People coming together to heal the planet. One image stood out to him. A group of school children planting trees in a barren field. Jesus explained that this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was part of a larger movement to reforest the country. Jake saw volunteers of all ages working alongside scientists and conservationists, planting millions of trees and restoring habitats. Waterways that had once been polluted were coming back to life. Jake watched as a team of engineers designed a system to clean a river that ran through a major city. Within months, the water was clear and fish were returning. People gathered along the riverbanks to celebrate, their faces filled with joy. Another powerful image was of solar fields and wind farms stretching as far as the eye could see. Jesus explained that America had made a significant shift toward renewable energy. Jake could see the difference it made, not just in the environment, but in people's lives. There was less smog, cleaner air, and a renewed sense of stewardship over the earth. But Jesus also showed Jake that this progress wasn't automatic. It required hard work and sacrifices. People had to change their habits, rethink their priorities, and make difficult decisions. Yet the results were undeniable. The earth was healing, and so were the people living on it. One of the most profound things Jake saw was a spiritual awakening spreading across America. Jesus explained that this wasn't about any one religion or belief system. It was about people reconnecting with something bigger than themselves. Jake saw scenes of people gathering in parks, not for protests, but for prayer and reflection. Families sat together, talking about their hopes and dreams. Churches, temples, and other places of worship were filled, not out of obligation, but because people genuinely wanted to be there. Jesus showed Jake a powerful moment where people of different faiths came together to help rebuild a community devastated by a tornado. They didn't focus on their differences. Instead, they united around their shared belief in love and compassion. Jake could see how this spirit of collaboration was changing hearts and minds. What stood out most was the kindness Jake witnessed. Strangers helping strangers, neighbors looking out for one another, and communities standing together in the face of hardship. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of conflict and misunderstanding. But the overall trend was one of healing and hope. One of the most heartwarming parts of Jake's vision was seeing the role that families and communities played in America's recovery. Jesus showed Jake that the strength of the nation didn't come from its leaders or its institutions alone. It came from its people, especially the bonds they formed with those closest to them. Jake saw images of families sitting together at dinner tables, something that had become rare in many households. Parents were taking more time to talk to their children, and children were sharing their hopes and fears without hesitation. There was a renewed focus on teaching values like kindness, patience, and hard work. Jesus explained that families were becoming the foundation of a stronger, more united society. In one scene, Jake saw a small town hit hard by a flood. Instead of waiting for outside help, the neighbors came together to rebuild. They shared tools, food, and labor, working side by side until every house was repaired. Jesus pointed out a woman in this vision who had lost everything. Despite her own hardship, she made sandwiches for the workers every day, refusing to let her misfortune stop her from giving. Jake noticed that this spirit of unity wasn't limited to small towns. In cities, people were forming neighborhood groups to clean parks, assist the elderly, and mentor at-risk youth. Churches and community centers became hubs of activity, hosting free workshops, meal programs, and even job training sessions. Jesus made it clear that these grassroots efforts were the true heroes of America's recovery. As Jake's vision expanded beyond America, Jesus showed him how the spirit of collaboration was spreading worldwide. Jake saw leaders from different countries coming together to solve problems that no single nation could handle alone. There were meetings where people spoke different languages, but their goals were the same: peace, sustainability, and mutual prosperity. One striking image Jake described was of a joint mission to provide clean drinking water to impoverished regions. Scientists and engineers from multiple nations worked together to develop affordable water filtration systems. Jake saw children in remote villages drinking clean water for the first time, their laughter filling the air. Jake also witnessed breakthroughs in healthcare. Teams of doctors and researchers from around the globe joined forces to combat diseases, sharing knowledge and resources without concern for profit or recognition. Jesus explained that this spirit of generosity and shared purpose was transforming the world. But the path to global unity wasn't without its challenges. Jake saw moments of tension, where cultural differences and past grievances threatened to derail progress. Yet, in every instance, Jesus showed Jake examples of people choosing dialogue over conflict, finding common ground instead of focusing on what divided them. Jesus gave Jake a special message to share with children everywhere. Jake remembered Jesus kneeling down to look him in the eye, his expression both serious and kind. "Children are the key to the future," Jesus said. "They see the world with fresh eyes and unbroken hope." Jake saw images of children leading the way in their schools and communities. In one scene, a group of kids organized a recycling drive that inspired their entire town to adopt more sustainable practices. In another, a young girl started a reading club to help her classmates improve their literacy, proving that small actions could make a big difference. Jesus emphasized that children have a unique ability to inspire adults. Jake saw how their questions, simple, honest, and direct, challenged grown-ups to think differently. Questions like, "Why can't we all just get along?" and "What can I do to help?" became sparks for change. Jake felt empowered by this part of his vision. He realized that even as a child, he had a role to play in shaping the future. Jesus made it clear that every small act of kindness, every effort to learn and grow, contributed to a larger wave of positive change. While Jesus' vision was filled with hope, it also came with a warning. Jake saw what could happen if people became complacent, assuming that progress would continue on its own. In one haunting image, he saw communities falling apart because people stopped putting in the effort to stay connected. Neighbors who once worked together began drifting apart, focusing only on their own problems. Jesus explained that complacency was one of the greatest threats to unity. It wasn't enough to achieve progress. People had to maintain it. Jake saw examples of leaders who grew too comfortable in their positions, neglecting the needs of their people. He also saw families who stopped communicating, letting small disagreements grow into larger conflicts. But Jesus also showed Jake how to avoid this fate. The key was constant vigilance, a willingness to keep working for what mattered. Jake saw reminders of this in small but powerful ways. Parents teaching their kids the value of hard work, communities celebrating milestones together, and leaders holding themselves accountable. One of the most powerful parts of Jake's vision was seeing how prayer and faith played a role in America's transformation. Jesus showed Jake scenes of people turning to prayer not as a last resort, but as a source of strength and guidance. In one image, Jake saw a family praying together before a meal, their faces filled with gratitude. In another, he saw a group of strangers holding hands in a hospital waiting room, praying for a loved one they had never met. Jake noticed that faith wasn't limited to churches or religious settings. It was in the way people treated each other, the choices they made, and the hope they carried in their hearts. Jesus explained that faith wasn't just about believing in him. It was about believing in the goodness of people and the possibility of a better future. Prayer, Jake saw, was a way for people to connect with something greater than themselves. It reminded them that they weren't alone, even in their darkest moments. Jake felt this deeply during his own near-death experience. He understood that faith wasn't about having all the answers. It was about trusting that, no matter what, there was a plan. In Jake's vision, Jesus showed him moments that could only be described as miraculous. These weren't grand, earth-shattering events, but quiet, powerful reminders of hope and resilience. Jake saw miracles unfolding in the lives of ordinary people, acts of kindness, healing, and transformation that left him in awe. One scene Jake recalled vividly was of a small-town hospital where doctors had given up hope on a critically ill patient. Jake watched as the patient's family gathered around, praying with a faith so pure it seemed to light up the room. Against all odds, the patient began to recover, leaving the doctors stunned. Jesus explained that this was the power of love and faith working together, a miracle born not from divine intervention alone, but from the strength of human spirit. Jake also saw a young boy rescuing a stray dog trapped in rising floodwaters. The boy's courage inspired his entire community to band together and save other animals and people affected by the disaster. Jesus pointed out that miracles weren't always supernatural. They often came in the form of bravery, compassion, and selflessness. Another scene involved scientific breakthroughs that seemed almost too good to be true. Jake saw researchers developing cures for diseases that had plagued humanity for decades. Jesus explained that these advances were part of his plan, made possible through the collaboration and dedication of people who refused to give up. Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude for these glimpses of hope. They reminded him that even in the darkest times, miracles were all around us, if we had the eyes to see them. Jake's journey back to the living world was as sudden as it was overwhelming. One moment, he was standing with Jesus in the midst of breathtaking visions. The next, he felt a jolt, like being pulled from a warm, safe place into something cold and chaotic. He opened his eyes to find himself in a hospital bed, his parents sobbing with relief at his side. The first thing Jake remembered was the sound of his mother's voice. "He's awake. Oh, thank God," she cried, clutching his hand like she never wanted to let go. Jake's body ached, and his mind felt foggy, but his heart was full. He had so much to share, but he struggled to find the words. As the days passed, Jake began to recount his experience to his family. At first, they thought it was a dream, a figment of his imagination, but the clarity and detail with which he described his journey left them speechless. Jake's father, a skeptic by nature, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about life and faith. Jake noticed that he felt different, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. He had a sense of purpose he couldn't explain, a need to share the visions and messages Jesus had given him. He wasn't just a boy recovering from an accident. He was a messenger, carrying hope and warnings for anyone willing to listen. Jake's near-death experience changed him in ways he never could have imagined. Before the accident, he was a typical 10-year-old, focused on his own little world. But after returning from his journey, he found himself thinking about others. His family, his friends, and even people he had never met. He started speaking at church gatherings and community events, sharing his story with anyone who wanted to hear it. At first, people were skeptical. Some dismissed him as a kid with an overactive imagination. But the sincerity in his voice and the vividness of his descriptions began to win them over. Jake wasn't just telling a story, he was offering hope. Jake's vision also changed the way he lived his life. He became more patient, more forgiving, and more willing to help others. He started volunteering at local shelters with his parents, collecting donations for families in need. He even started a small group at his school to promote kindness and understanding among his classmates. Jake's story ends with a message not just for America, but for the world. He encourages everyone to look at their own lives and ask, "What can I do to make a difference?" Whether it's reaching out to a neighbor, volunteering in your community, or simply being kinder to those around you, Jake believes that small actions can lead to big changes. Jake often says, "I'm just a kid. If I can do something, so can you." His story is a reminder that we all have the power to shape the future, one choice at a time. The vision he shared isn't just a glimpse of what could be. It's a call to action for all of us to create a better, more united world.